that reveals how a series of vulnerabilities have converged to create a perfect storm for Europe. The ripple effects of these weaknesses stretch far beyond spreadsheets. This energy crisis isn't just about high bills. Emerging powers like China and India rise, Europe's role on the global stage is increasingly questioned. Europe lags behind the US and China in critical areas like AI, semiconductors, and 5G. Imagine a continent that once stood as a symbol of stability, progress, and unity, now grappling with a storm of interconnected crises.
So what is going on here? Europe has fallen well behind the USA in terms of raw economic output as the continent closes in on almost 2 decades of relative stagnation.
Europe, a global leader in many ways, finds itself at a crossroads, battling economic stagnation, demographic decline, and geopolitical challenges that threaten its standing on the global stage. Let me walk you through the layers of this unfolding story. One that reveals how a series of vulnerabilities have converged to create a perfect storm for Europe. Europe's economic challenges begin with its staggering levels of public debt. Nations like Italy, Greece, and Spain carry debt burdens so high that even a minor economic shock could send ripples through its fragile systems.
The bad news is that a lot of the current economic problems in Europe causing its slowdown are largely self-inflicted.
Slow economic growth exacerbates the problems. Unlike emerging markets or even the US, Europe struggles under the weight of high taxes, rigid labor markets, and a maze of regulations that suffocate innovation and entrepreneurship.
Innovation. If the continent can't bring in more workers or provide them with better inputs or make them work longer hours or keep the most educated on shore, the only option left is really the best option, which is just to give them better technology to conduct their business.
Add to that a heavy dependence on external resources, energy, raw materials, and even manufactured goods, and you have an economy vulnerable to global supply chain disruptions and price hikes. The ripple effects of these weaknesses stretch far beyond spreadsheets. They shape the daily lives of millions. Energy, the lifeblood of any economy, has become Europe's Achilles heel.
Now, for a long time, this didn't really matter because the continent had a cheap source of natural gas to fuel its energy-intensive industries like heavy manufacturing coming from Russia. But obviously there have been some complications with that recently.
The continent's historical over-reliance on Russian gas left it exposed when geopolitical tensions escalated, such as during the recent Ukraine conflict. Scrambling to diversify energy resources, Europe faced skyrocketing prices, forcing industries to relocate to regions with cheaper energy like Asia and the US.
The problem is, with reduced purchasing power, high salary and benefit requirements, expensive energy, and very tight regulations, it's hard for businesses to find a compelling reason to manufacture in Europe. Its energy transition is also not going to be helped by the fact that it's falling behind the USA and China in terms of renewable technology.
Even the green energy transition, while a commendable long-term goal, has proven costly, slow, and inadequate for the immediate energy demands.
Now, Europe, and especially the EU, does not have large energy reserves. Really, the only place with large fossil fuel deposits on the European continent is the North Sea, where production is controlled by Norway, which was never a member of the EU, and the UK, which is no longer a member of the EU.
This energy crisis isn't just about high bills. It's about industrial decline, job losses, and a growing sense of economic insecurity. Demographics compound the problem. With one of the oldest populations globally, Europe faces a shrinking workforce that struggles to sustain pension systems and economic productivity.
Europe has more people with more competitive salary expectations, education levels that are just as good, if not better than the USA. It's largely a safe, stable business environment, and it has the capacity to be a major global hub. In fact, historically, it has been. So yeah, it's become more difficult, less popular, and less effective to grow the size of the population. Working more isn't really working, and while the European population has become more educated, it's losing a lot of its most technical workers to better opportunities in the USA.
Fertility rates in most countries are below the replacement rate. And while migration is a partial solution, it comes with its own set of challenges, including social integration and strains on public services. This demographic decline isn't just a future problem, it's happening right now.
The second thing is that workers in Europe on average spend much less time at work than in the US, with a few exceptions. But the big centres like France, Spain, Italy, and especially Germany really like their time off.
And its impact is visible in everything from healthcare systems to labour markets. Europe's geopolitical influence is also waning. As emerging powers like China and India rise, Europe's role on the global stage is increasingly questioned. The US, its long-term ally, now often views Europe as a junior partner rather than an equal.
The European Union, as well as other closely integrated European countries, collectively make up the second largest economy in the world, only really falling behind the USA. Germany alone is now the third largest economy in the world after overtaking a stagnant Japan, and the continent is overwhelmingly made up of high-income, advanced economies with great living standards. But a lot of economists are very, very worried about Europe's future.
We have said many times that growth has been slowing down for a long time in Europe. But we've ignored it. Until 2 years ago, we would never have such a conversation as the one we're having today.
Internal divisions within the EU over fiscal policies, migration, and sovereignty further collectively weaken decision making.
Even if it was literally a silver bullet to fix an aging and stagnating economy with zero side effects, there is going to be resistance to something that can fundamentally change societal dynamics.
Europe's reliance on NATO for security highlights a troubling reality. The continent struggles to defend itself independently in an increasingly volatile world. The industrial heart of Europe, once a powerhouse of global manufacturing, is also under threat.
And finally, more labour force participation isn't necessarily a good thing. In Europe, the upwards trend has mostly been caused by older people needing to stay in work for longer just to survive, rather than a broader push to mobilise the population into higher rates of production.
Many industries have moved their operations to countries with lower costs, leading to job losses and a reduced manufacturing base.
This is a major problem because a lot of high-end value creation in the modern world is done through technology. People assembling basic goods by hand will only be adding a few dollars an hour in value. Give those people the world's best industrial tools, advanced training on how to use them, and optimize workflows, and they can produce 10 times as much stuff and justify incomes 10 times higher. But it's still based on unit by unit output. However, someone developing something, even if they spend a few hours making minor improvements to an existing product design, can add value to every single unit that's produced from then on out, making the value they've added in those few hours of work potentially limitless.
Technologically, Europe lags behind the US and China in critical areas like AI, semiconductors, and 5G.
Now, of course, there are exceptions. ASML, which makes the photolithography machines to create semiconductors, is based in the Netherlands. This one example may be the most technologically significant company in the world. But outside of this one exception that proves the rule, it would be hard to think of a European company that could be considered cutting edge.
This dependence on imports, especially in industries like automotives and pharmaceuticals, exposes Europe to external shocks and limits its ability to compete in a rapidly evolving global market.
China is producing the solar panels that Europe is hopefully going to power itself with in the future, which has potentially just replaced one type of energy dependence for another. Now, of course, renewables are a long-term capital investment rather than something that needs a constant supply, so it's not exactly the same, but it does highlight the other area almost everybody agrees that Europe is falling behind in.
Financial instability looms large as well. Despite over a decade since the 2008 financial crisis, Europe's banking sector still grapples with its The Eurozone structure, which binds together economies with vastly different fiscal policies, creates constant tensions and leaves weaker economies exposed to market volatility.
Across different metrics, a wide gap in GDP has opened up between the EU and the US, driven mainly by a more pronounced slowdown in productivity growth in Europe. Europe's households have paid the price in foregone living standards.
This instability makes long-term planning a challenge for businesses and governments alike. All of these challenges is Europe's overdependence on global supply chains. The pandemic showed just how fragile these connections can be, disrupting trade and highlighting Europe's lack of strategic resources like rare earth minerals. These materials, essential for green energy and tech industries, are largely imported, leaving Europe at the mercy of geopolitical shifts and supply chain disruptions. Political instability and the rise of populism adds another layer of complexity. Economic dissatisfaction and migration issues fuel nationalist movements, leading to fragmented governments and challenges.
Worries about an economic future with a weak and fractured Europe.
One of the most important things for the next few years is going to be the strength and the sustainability of the European economy. We are living in a new world that is very different from the last 20 years. And it's not clear to me that Europe is ready for it.
Brexit, a stark example of these pressures, has left the EU questioning its cohesion and resilience. Meanwhile, migration pressures continue to add strain to social systems, with millions of refugees fleeing conflicts in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia ending up in Europe.
This is the world's deadliest border. The Mediterranean Sea. Thousands die here every year trying to cross from North Africa to Europe. The European Union is claiming
human rights
that people are drowning on its doorstep.
We call this politics of letting die.
The EU is struggling to deal with migration, with severe consequences.
The global competitive landscape paints a grim picture for Europe. Asian economies, particularly China and India, are outpacing Europe in growth, manufacturing, and technical innovation.
The problem is not that Europe lacks ideas or ambition, but innovation is blocked at the next stage. We are failing to translate innovation into commercialization, and innovative companies that want to scale up in Europe are hindered at every stage by inconsistent and restrictive regulation.
Europe's regulatory environment, while aiming to ensure fairness and sustainability, often stifles the very innovation needed to compete on a global scale. Climate change adds another burden, with extreme weather events, agricultural disruptions, and increasing reliance on food imports creating vulnerabilities that cannot be ignored. And then there's the broader question of leadership. Europe's underinvestment in defense and its fragmented responses to global crises erode its credibility. China's growing economic footprint in Europe through initiatives like the Belt and Road and investments in critical infrastructure highlights the continent's vulnerabilities to external influence these days. Meanwhile, Europe's social welfare systems, while admirable, are increasingly unsustainable in the face of economic stagnation, aging populations, and widening inequality. This web of challenges, economic, demographic, geopolitical, and social, is more than just a series of isolated issues. It's a deeply interconnected system where one crisis exacerbates another. The question isn't just whether Europe can overcome these challenges, it's whether it can reimagine itself to thrive in a rapidly changing world. And that's a story we all have a stake in.